We are on Daf Pei Base Amid Base 82b, and we learned in the Mishnah that Pesach has to be burnt right away if there is an internal or intrinsic invalidation in the carbon. If there's an invalidation of the owner, meaning he became tamei, so then you have to wait till ubetzura. You have to wait till the next day when the carbon itself becomes invalid. And then you can't burn it that day. You would have to burn it the next day because on Yantiv you can't burn the kachim. And in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says actually, even if the owner of the carbon is invalid, is tamei, and therefore invalid for the carbon by carbon Pesach, since that's the main point of the carbon Pesach is for people to eat it. So that's an intrinsic invalidation in the carbon itself, the Gemara is sort of source for the where you burn it and that you burn it the next day. And now the Gemara had a halacha Moshe Sinai and a pasuk to tell us that it's burnt in the courtyard, and that anything that's kodesh, that's invalid. And we also had a source from Aaron, from the story of the children of Aaron, and for that the Gemara said, that's the way it was in that scenario where the children died that day and they didn't eat the carbon and they burnt it. But it wasn't. That's not the source for learning that if a carbon is taken outside of the borders of where it's supposed to be, that it would be invalid. Now, this was all based upon that anytime the carbon has an intrinsic invalidation, you burn it right away. However, we've seen an opinion earlier, and the Gemara is going to ask about that opinion now, that there's an opinion that says that even a carbon that has an intrinsic invalidation, the highest of which would be pigul, they having had the wrong intent while shechting it to eat it beyond its time, which invalidates the carbon, and anybody that eats of that carbon has kares. The soul is cut off of its source. It's a severe punishment, which tells us that this is perhaps the most severe intrinsic invalidation of a carbon. And yet, there's an opinion that says that you don't burn it that day, you burn it the next day. This is about 10, 12 lines into 82b. And according to the opinion of the Brisa quoted in the Academy of Rabbi Barabua, the Amar that says, Afila pigul toin ibertsura, even pigul, which is this more severe invalidation of a carbon, toin ibertsura requires you have to wait till the next day, and only then is it going to be allowed to be burned. I mean, Nolan, how does he know this idea? That you burn a carbon that's invalid, but not the day that it became invalid. You have to wait till the next day. So Yalef Avid Oven Minosa. He learns it from Nosa. What is Nosa? Nosa is a carbon that is supposed to be eaten on that day and that night, and then the next day it's not supposed to be eaten anymore, and you left it over to the next day. You have to burn it. So that's always that it's been left over to the next day. So too, pigul, this invalidation would also be that you left it over for the next day. So why is he saying that he's learning the juxtaposition, not the juxtaposition, the comparison of the words oven, sin, from Nosar? Why doesn't he learn from the story by the children of Aaron and this chatas that was burnt that very day? Indeed, the same scenario as the children of Aaron, and that when they died, where the sin offering of that Rosh Chodesh, which is like today Rosh Chodesh, but that was Rosh Chodesh of the inauguration. Is Nisan? It was the inauguration of the Mishkan, and it was the chatas was burned because it was invalid. And we'll see. We saw the Gemara brought it yesterday, trying to prove the idea of a carbon outside of its place, it becomes burned. And we'll see later a discussion about what was the invalidation, why Aaron didn't eat that carbon. In any case, so over there, it was on that same day. Why don't we learn oven from there? So the Gemara says that in that case, that type of carbon itself would have required being burned the next day for the rest of generations. So why did Aaron burn it that day? So it was a specific teaching for that very moment. This is a harasha, is a concept where there is an exception to the halachic requirements of a specific mitzvah, a specific prohibition, where for a specific moment or for a specific time that change. We'll see some more about that in the distinctions between Pesach Mitzrayim, the way they ate the carbon Pesach, the teaching for that particular year, versus in Egypt, versus the rest of the carbon Pesach. So they ate it with a staff in their hand and their belt and their shoes on. And obviously these are not obligations we have. Also, Eliyahu Hanavi brought a sacrifice on Mount Carmel, which is prohibited, but it was a harasha. So there's a concept of harasha, a teaching for the moment. And that's what happened over there, that Aaron burned the carbon. Aaron burnt the carbon as a harasha, a particular teaching for that moment. We are now the last 5-6 lines of the narrow lines of 82b. Hashta d'amrina, kol pesule de kodesh b'sreifa. Now that we say that anything that is an invalidation in a carbon, and it needs to be burned, loishna the kachikachim, regardless of whether it was a more supreme kodesh, the loishna bekachikalim, or a minor kodesh, gemara gemula, and we know that from halacha Moshe Sinai, as we saw yesterday. So bakodesh beishti sarif lamali. So what I need a teaching that bakodesh beishti sarif, that it has to be in the kodesh, that you burn it in the Beis Hamikdash. Lamali. So what I need that teaching bakodesh beishti sarif. Gemara says hahumi boyle shesrifasa bekodesh. That's to tell you. You have to where to burn it. Not that you have to burn something that's kodesh, but where you have to burn it. Hold on 1 second, please. So the pasuk that we had is to tell us the time, the place where the burning has to take place. Now the pasuk v'habasa sheyiga b'chol tamei, and the meat of a carbon that touches something tamei, lo yiyachel, may not be eaten be'eshi sarif, it shall be burnt by fire. Why do I need that pasuk for? Lamali. I need it for itself. I may have thought when it's anything that's invalid from Kodesh, Kagoin Landama, the blood was overnight, meaning that it was past the sunset. They didn't spritz it on the day the carbon was brought. V'nishbach dama, or the blood got spilt. V'yatza dama, or the blood was taken outside of the area that it's supposed to be in, meaning it went either inside the Kodesh, inside the Beis Hamikdash, or outside of the courtyard. V'nishchata balayla, or it was shechted at night. The besreifa, that they get burned. The lesson of bechulin, because that's something that doesn't apply to non-Kodesh. All these are specifically kachim, specifically an invalidation of a carbon. Aval nitma dechulin, nami mifsal. But if in regards to becoming tummy, where I could say, look, that just makes it a mundane, regular thing. It takes away the Kodesh, because that applies to anything. Even non-hektish can become tummy. Perhaps since you treated it like a chol, a weekday thing, meaning that it's a mundane thing, it's non-Kodesh because you treated it like a regular animal of yours and it became tamei. So maybe it is chulin. Maybe that just demotes it from kodesh into mundane, and therefore I would think it doesn't require it to be burned. And it would be sufficient to just bury it. Kamash Milan. So that's what this teaching tells us, that no, it does require burning. That's what we need that pasuk for. But indeed, the idea that kachim gets burned when it becomes invalidated is halacha Moshe Sinai. The place that it gets burned and that even tumah gets burned, that's the two psukim we have. So we had a machlokes, as we mentioned in the Mishnah, if the invalidation of the person himself, does that also require burning right away, or do you have to wait till the next day? The first opinion in the Mishnah said only if the invalidation is intrinsic to the carbon itself, that's when you burn it on that very day. Otherwise, it needs to uber tzura, has to be left overnight until the next day, and then the carbon is intrinsically invalid because it was left overnight, and then you can burn it. And by Pesach, that's going to be Yom Tov morning, so you couldn't do it then, so you would have to wait till Chol Hamoed in order to burn it. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says no, since the entirety of the carbon of a carbon Pesach is connected to the people eating it, and nobody can eat it, so that's an intrinsic invalidation of the carbon and requires burning even that same day. Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef said, "Machlekes shenitmu u'bailim achazarika." The machlekes is that the owners became tamei after you already spritzed the blood. So the ischazi basal achila, where for a moment at least the carbon was edible, and therefore there's a machlokes of whether or not that would count as an intrinsic invalidation or not. But if even before the blood spritzed, the owner became tamei, where it never was valid to be eaten, so that's an intrinsic invalidation of carbon pesach, and everybody would agree you need to burn it miyad, right away. So mesaveh, we ask a contradiction. Any invalidation that's in the intrinsic to the carbon, you burn right away. But if it's invalidation in the blood and in the or in the owners, so that's not intrinsic to the carbon, but it's to a secondary part that is a requirement with the carbon, then you have to wait till the next day. And only the next day do you take it out to be burned. We say the owner, similar to the blood, and the blood always, if it became invalid, it always is before you spritz the blood, because once you spritz the blood, there's no need for the blood. It doesn't make a difference. So too, so too, the owner is always going to be even before spritzing the blood. So you see from the comparison in the Mishnah that that blood and owner are the same, that the invalidation in the carbon, a secondary invalidation, is whether the blood became tamei or spilled on the ground or something happened to it, or an invalidation to the owner. And of course, the invalidation to the blood has to be that it's before you spritz it, because once you spritz it, there's no need for the blood anymore. So it has to be beforehand. So to the owner became tamei, invalid, also before you spritz the blood, and meaning the carbon was never edible, and yet Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says that it is an intrinsic invalidation, and the Chachamim say it's not an intrinsic invalidation. So if there was a statement like this, this is what was said in the name of Rabbi Yosef said. The machlekes is only when the owner became tamei before the blood was spritzed, where in that case the carbon was never edible, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says it's an intrinsic invalidation of the carbon because there's nobody to eat this, and the Chachamim say still it's secondary to the carbon, and therefore you can't burn it yet. Which at least Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says it's like an invalidation in the body, in the intrinsically to the carbon. But if the owner became tame only after the blood was spritzed. This chazi basal achila, where it was edible for a moment, and so therefore the carbon intrinsically was never valid. Everybody would agree that the invalidation is secondary to the carbon, that the carbon itself is valid. And even Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka would say, by B'tsura, you can't burn the carbon that day. You can only burn it the next day. However, this is the Rabbi Yosef said that. Rabbi Yochanan says no difference. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka does not distinguish, and he says you burn it the same day, regardless of whether or not it's valid on. It was valid for a moment to be eaten because the owner became tamei after you spritz the blood, or whether the owner became tamei before you spritz the blood. Either way. But for a carbon pesach, this is going to be an intrinsic invalidation to the carbon because nobody can eat it. Rabbi Yochanan follows his opinion elsewhere. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Rabbi Nechemia Amar Davaracha, that Rabbi Yochanan said that our opinion in our Mishnah, where Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said that the carbon pesach, even if there's an invalidation with the owner, that you burn it right away because that's intrinsic to the carbon pesach because nobody can eat it, is similar to the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia. What did Rabbi Nechemia say? Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka in our Mishnah, Rabbi Nechemia Mahi. What did Rabbi Nechemia say? The Tanya, Rabbi Nechemia Omer. Rabbi Nechemia says, we saw yesterday and we talked about it briefly today, that at the inauguration of the Mishkan, Nadav and Avihu died, and Aaron was in the middle of doing the service, and the carbon of the day, the chatas of Rosh Chodesh, was burned. And Moshe challenged him and said, "Why did you burn it? Why didn't you eat it? As we saw yesterday, the blood wasn't taken into the inner chambers; it wasn't into the Kodesh, so it didn't leave its area. So it's not an intrinsic invalidation. So you shouldn't have burn it. And so why did Aaron burn it? He says that the reason that he burnt it was because Aaron was an onain, an immediate relative, had died on that day, obviously not buried yet. And the halacha is that an onain, somebody who had an immediate relative die, is asur lechel b'kachim, is not allowed to eat kodesh. We learn it from Maaser by the statement that somebody when they do their Maaser, the tithe. So after they complete the year, so they say, I did not eat the Maaser. I didn't eat it in sadness and oni. We saw this earlier in the Masechta. And so if Maaser, which is a more lenient in kachim, may not be eaten in aninus, when somebody had an immediate family member die and it wasn't buried yet. So for sure, kachim cannot be eaten. So now, lakach nemar ko'ela. Now, and that's why he says that. After all, this has happened to me. This has happened to me, meaning that his children died, and he can't eat the carbon. Now, this aninus va'aninus kala'achaz rikahava, and the aninus is before after is not connected to the idea of when the carbon was spritzed, because it's not an invalidation in the blood. It's an invalidation with the person. So even if Nadav and Avihu would have died before the spritzing of the blood, the spritzing would not become invalidated, because the only reason we say by carbon pesach that it makes a difference if it happened before spritzing or after spritzing is that's when the carbon is available to be eaten by the owner. So if it was after spritzing the blood, so the carbon is already available to be eaten. So maybe you can think it counts as if the invalidation happened, not intrinsic to the carbon because the carbon is edible. So it must have been that it's considered a secondary invalidation. But in regards to a chatas, this chatas, it's irrelevant when the spritzing the blood is, because that's not going to make it valid to be eaten. So therefore, it's always going to be considered as if it's after the spritzing of the blood. The carbon itself is not, the spritzing is not what's going to make it permissible to be eaten. And still, he said that it's invalid on account of anina. So you see, regardless of whether or not there's somebody to eat the carbon, that's not the invalidation. The invalidation is that since the owner cannot partake of the carbon, so that's invalid to the carbon itself. So too over here by the carbon Pesach, even after the spritzing of the blood, it's going to count as the carbon is invalid. And yet we see that over there, Rabbi Nechemia says that it was burnt right away, and the reason was for aninus, which counts as if even it's after the spritzing of the blood. So too over here, we have this idea that an invalidation of the owner is going to be sufficient to say that the carbon is invalid, and you burn it right away, as opposed to the first opinion in our Mishnah that says that if the invalidation is intrinsic to the carbon, to the flesh of the carbon, to the animal, that's when you're going to burn it right away. If the invalidation is to the owner, it's not going to be burnt right away. And now we have our Mishnah's opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka that by the carbon Pesach you do burn it right away. The owner not being able to eat is like an intrinsic invalidation in the carbon. And we have Rabbi Nechemia that says the same. The reason why by Aaron they burnt the carbon right away was because they were in aninus, they were in mourning from the loss of their immediate relative prior to the burial, and that counts as an invalidation. So we see that both Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and Rabbi Nechemia are saying the same thing. Now Rabbah at the top of Pei Gimel Amud Aleph is going to say that also Rabbi Yossi Aglili says the same thing, and the Gemara is going to make a distinction. Rabbi Meisef Af Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that Rabbi Yossi Aglili also would say this. The Tani we learned, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Kola Indian Kulai, the entire conversation about chatas asher yuvadoma, a carbon chatas, which its blood was taken outside of its confines where it's supposed to be, is that you burn it. That's the simple reading would be that there's an invalidation in the blood. And he says that, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that this is just the way this carbon is supposed to be burnt. It's about the bulls that are burned, or goats that are burnt. To tell you that if they became invalid, these special type of karbanos that become burned, that are they have a different halacha, and you burn them. They're called paraman esrafim or sirman esrafim because of the bulls and goats that get burned, because of these halachas that they specifically get burned. If they are invalidated, you burn them in front of the Beis Hamikdash. And a prohibition to eat them. And there the invalidation of the sul yotze, which is when a carbon is brought outside of its confines. So the word yotze means going out, but even if it's brought inward, it's outside of the area that it's supposed to be. And he says that the burning of a carbon when it goes out, 1 second, that you burn it in the area of the Beis Hamikdash, not outside of the three camps where normally you would burn this carbon. When it became invalid, you burn it on the inside. So the paraman esrafim, generally, the idea is that you do the service in the Beis Hamikdash and then take the the carbon itself, and you wouldn't burn it on the mizbeach, but you would burn it outside of the three camps. And if it became invalid, then you actually burn it inside the three camps. You burn it in the azara, in the courtyard in front of the Beis Hamikdash. So they said to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and so where do we know the invalidation of a chatas, a sin offering, that the blood was brought inward? That we learned from Aaron, which we saw yesterday, that the children of Aaron died. And Moshe says to them, "Why did you burn it? Why did you burn the carbon? After all, the blood wasn't taken inward," which indicates us mechlal the inafik ihi, that if the blood had been taken out, inami ayil, or it gone in, as we said, that the invalidation would be regardless, as long as it's not in its space that it's supposed to be, whether it's taken further out of the Beis Hamikdash or further into the Beis Hamikdash, then it's supposed to go. That besreifa, and it gets burned, and and that's an invalidation. Secondary, that's an invalidation of the blood. It's not in the meat itself, and yet you burn it right away. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not a good comparison. That's not an invalidation in the owner. That's an invalidation in the blood. So it's true, an invalidation in the blood is not in the carbon itself, in the meat, but it is a part of the animal. And so, yes, if there's an invalidation of the blood, the meat also has to be burned that day. It's an invalidation intrinsic. So the blood and the meat's one. But the owner, that's secondary. So maybe Rabbi Yossi Aglili would still hold, even though that he says that invalidation in the blood means an invalidation in the carbon, and you burn it, and it's intrinsic to the carbon, and you burn it right away. That's true for the blood that needs to be spritzed and was taken out of the wrong area, into the wrong area. Whereas an invalidation of the owner, that he would also say is secondary and invalid. An invalidation that has to wait to the next day to burn it, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan just said that our Mishnah's opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and Rabbi Nechemia are the same, but Rabbi Yossi Aglili is not. So the next Mishnah takes us back to the invalidations of the Korban Pesach. We know the Korban Pesach, you have to eat all of it, and anything that's left over gets burned. And the Mishnah is going to say included in that is also the bones and the sinews, the essentially the tendons. So atzamis v'agidin v'hanoisar, and anything that's left over, the bones, the tendons, and anything that's left over, yisarfu b'shisha asar. You don't burn it on the next morning after the Seder because it's Yantiv and you're not allowed to burn it. Only allowed to cook on Yantiv that which you're going to eat on Yantiv. And obviously this is not allowed to be eaten, so you have to burn it the next day. And in fact, if the next day is Shabbos, Chalta Zayin is b'Shabbos, Yisufur b'Yud Zayin, then you can only burn it on the 17th, the following day, because burning kachim does not supersede Shabbos Yantiv. And now the Gemara is going to get into the idea, why did the Mishnah even mention bones? After all, the bones are not leftovers because you can't eat the bones. So that's not a leftover carbon. It was never meant to be eaten. So Gemara is going to be talking about bones that have marrow that you think is edible, and therefore, since you could eat it, it needs to be burned. Even though that you're not allowed to break the bone of a Korban Pesach, so you can't get to the marrow. But essentially, the bone is a pocket servicing the edible marrow, and therefore it needs to be burned as leftovers. Amar Amari bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. So Amar bar Abba said, name Rabbi Yitzchak, Katzamis Kachim, the bones of a carbon, sheshimshu noisar, which serviced the noisar, meaning it has marrow inside, so it serviced the noisar. Metamen asidai. So they would make your hands tame, which is one of the 18 enactments of hand tuma in regards to leftovers of a carbon. So there's a rabbinic enactment of tuma for leftover kachim, where it makes a hand's tummy. And since this is a basis, and this is a support for the prohibited item, meaning the marrow, and so the bone itself also is going to cause tuma. Name a messiah, and let's say that we can support that from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says our Mishnah says leftovers has to be burned, but it also enumerates specifically. It mentions the bones. Now, bones, if they're leftovers, they're leftovers. If they're not, they're not. And it specifically mentions it because bones really shouldn't be leftovers because you can't eat it. So why does it count as a leftover? Because the bones are servicing the marrow. Now, what kind of bones are we talking about? That has no marrow in it. Why do you have to burn it even? You could just toss it because it's not considered leftovers because it was never edible, so it's never a part of the carbon. Must be that it has marrow. And since it has marrow, that counts as the bone servicing an edible part of the carbon. So if you tell me that when something services the leftover edible meat, and in this case the marrow, it counts as leftovers. So now that we understand that, so it requires burning. But if you're going to tell me that an item that serviced the nosar, such as the bone which serviced the marrow, it contained it, lav milsi, it's nothing. So lamali l'sreifa, what do I have to burn it for? Nitberinu v'nechaltza. Just break the bone and remove the marrow. And burn it that way. And let the bone be tossed. So it must be that the bone, the reason you have to burn the bone, even though that the marrow is in there, and the bone itself is not edible, when the marrow is in there and the bone is not edible, is because the bone serviced an edible part of the carbon that was left over. Amri loy. So the Gemara says, no, that's not the reason. Really, I can tell you that a bone is not a part of the kachim. It's not edible, and it's not considered nosar. It's not considered leftovers, even though that it serviced the marrow. So why then do you have to burn the bone? And don't we say break the bone and get the marrow out? Because the Torah says do not break a bone in the carbon pesach. Not only in a kosher carbon, when it's already invalid, in the invalid part of carbon pesach, also you're not allowed to break the bone. So it's leftover carbon pesach. It's true, it's not edible anymore, but you still can't break the bone to get the marrow out. So you have to burn the whole thing. Even a non-kosher carbon pesach entirely. But now we learned but we learned that there are no lashes, meaning seemingly the Gemara thinks no prohibition for somebody who leaves over a tahor carbon, or somebody who breaks the bone of a tummy carbon. There's no lashes for that, even though that generally there would be Torah prohibition for breaking the bone. There wouldn't be, the Gemara understands now, a prohibition for breaking the bone in a tummy carbon. The Gemara says it depends if it was once a valid carbon, so then the prohibition of breaking the bone is already in place, and obviously if it's leftovers, so it was once a kosher carbon because they ate it last night as a carbon pesach for their seder. So clearly it was a valid carbon at one point. So then you're not allowed to break the bone anymore, even though that now it's invalid. That halacha that it says that if it was tummy, you're allowed to break the bone, or there's no prohibition of breaking the bone. That's talking about where it was never a valid carbon. Umantana. So whose opinion is this that makes this distinction between whether or not it was at one point a valid carbon or not? Rabbi Yaakov, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yaakov the Tanya. We learned ve'etzem l'sish berubay. The Torah says, and do not break a bone in the carbon pesach. Boy, bekosher. In it when it's kosher, v'loy bepasul. But not when it's pasul. When it's invalid, it's not a valid carbon pesach, you're allowed to break the bone. Rabbi Yaakov, however, Rabbi Yaakov says, it depends. If it had a moment that it was a kosher carbon, v'nifsal, and then after it was kosher, then it became invalidated in some way, whether it became tamei, or in our case, where it became invalid because it was leftover, meaning it was completely, you did all the functions of the mitzvah, and then you have some leftovers. So, the prohibition of breaking the bone applies. If it was never a valid carbon, then there's no prohibition of breaking the bone. In any case, in our Mishnah, it says that you have to burn the bone, and the Gemara said, why do you have to burn the bone? The bone is never edible, so it's not considered leftovers. Well, there's marrow in there. And the marrow, you can't extract the marrow, because the only way to get the marrow from the bone is actually by breaking the bone. And even though it's currently not a valid carbon anymore, but it once was a valid carbon, and so you can't break the bone. You still cannot break the bone, according to Rabbi Yaakov. Rabbi Shimon says, no, in both of these cases, there's no prohibition of breaking the bone, regardless of when the invalidation came. Mesa Vesu ask a contradiction. Every kachim, the bones do not require burning. Besides for the bones of a korban pesach. Why? Because of a takala, because of the mistakes that can happen from it. So a regular carbon, non-carbon pesach, you don't have to burn the bones. What do? You just break it and extract the marrow and toss the bone. But the carbon pesach, which you're not allowed to break it, and the Gemara understands now what it means because of the mistake or problem by carbon pesach is that you're going to break the bone in order to get the marrow out. So therefore, you have to burn. You have to burn the bone. So what's the case of these bones? Again, if there's no marrow in there, so why would you have to burn it? There is nothing edible there, so it's not considered leftovers. So rather, what are you going to say? That there's marrow in the bone. So back to our first interpretation of the Gemara, first point, the Gemara tried to say, the bone is servicing the marrow, and that's why it has to be burned. So if you say the bone that services the marrow is considered something, so then why are you making a distinction between the bones versus the bones of carbon pesach to the bone of a regular kachim? If the reason is because they're servicing the marrow inside there, so every kachim is that way. From the fact that the Brisa made a distinction between marrow of a carbon pesach, where you have to burn the bone as well, it can't, and a regular carbon, which you don't have to burn the bone, you just break it and get the marrow out. So that tells you that the servicing of the pocket, the bone being the container of the remainder of the meat, is of no consequence at all. Because if it was, then even other carbonates, not only carbon pesach, needs to be burned. From the fact that we make a distinction about carbon pesach or not, we see that it's specific to carbon pesach that the bone needs to be burned, and there the reason is going to have to be because you can't break the bone. He says, no, that Bryce is talking about an entirely different scenario. This is somebody who finds a pile of bones from carbonas. And the question is, what are these? What's going on with these bones? Do they have to be burnt or not? And he finds them already broken with the marrow taken out. So shamatza chalutzin atzames kachim the ein behem b'shum shviros etzem. So by other carbonos where there's no prohibition of breaking them, so so you can assume that the marrow was taken out prior to it becoming leftovers. On the day the carbon was supposed to be eaten, they cut the bone and cooked the bone and took out the marrow and smeared on some bread and had some marrow, and they ate it. And so there was the bones never serviced leftovers, because who tells you there was ever leftovers there? Maybe the marrow was eaten in the proper time. So therefore, those bones of regular kachim don't have to be burned because you don't have to question whether or not the bones serviced a leftover meat. However, Atzmas Pesach the Yesh Behem Mishum Shvira said to him, but the leftover bones of a carbon Pesach where you're not allowed to break them. So the marrow inside there is something that needs to be burned, and then the bones would have serviced the marrow. No, basa they have a noiser hu dechalzinu, and even though you're not allowed to break the bone even after it became invalidated, but this person may not have known it, and you have to assume that the reason it's broken Pesach bones is obviously the person was mistaken. You don't have to assume that he broke it when he was eating it, which is a Torah prohibition. You have to assume that he didn't know that prohibition extends even after it became invalid. So then the bones would have been servicing the marrow, which is leftovers, and therefore the bone which serviced nosar has to be burned as well. Rav Tzvi Amar. Rav Tzvi said, no, the Brisa has a different meaning entirely. It means something else. What are we talking about? And now we turn to Pei Gimel on Amid Beis. Kagoin Shamatzin Tziburin Tziburin. He finds piles of bones, and he checks the upper layer of bones. And he finds on the upper layer has the marrow taken out already, and he doesn't know what's in the pile beneath in the rest of the pile. So Atzmas Kachim the Emem Mishum Shvira sets him. So if it's a carbon that pertains to regular carbonas, not to Kachim, not to carbon Pesach, where you can you're allowed to eat the marrow and break the bone even when you're obligated during the mitzvah. So Lakula Havachalasu. So you assume the entire pile he probably emptied out the marrow. And he ate it. So you don't have to burn any of these bones. Atzmas Pesach, but if it's a pile of bones of a carbon Pesach or multiple carbonas Pesach, the Yeshma Mishur Shvira sets him, where there is a prohibition of breaking the bone. Dilma Hanidachalsinu Lahanach. Maybe he broke them and extracted the marrow from from the upper bones, but the lower bones were not. And since you didn't check the whole pile, you have to burn the whole pile by Israel. So that's the explanation of the bones and the obligation in our Mishnah, the multiple opinions as to the burning of the bones. Is it on account of because you can't the marrow and you can't extract it, or is it because the bone serviced the marrow that was in there, and so it's considered a servicing of the marrow and requires to be burned. As Hashem Matzah Shabbos, we'll learn the next section of the Gemara dealing with the sinews with the gid, also the obligation to burn it as leftovers.